Ladies, gentlemen, and brethren, welcome to this evening's Solomon Live. We're live across the UK. Indeed, we are live across the world. I'm Brodie. I have the honour of being the Provincial Communications Officer for the distinguished province of Worcestershire and also the host of these monthly webinars of lively, engaging Freemason conversation. Now, if you'd like to put a question to our very special guest this evening, you can do that by the question and answer facility on Zoom. Now, this evening's Solomon Live is 1723 Constitutions Inventing the Future. What a statement. So please welcome our very special guest this evening, Dr. Ric Berman. Hello, Dr. Ric. Ric, how are you?
I'm very well, Brodie. I hope you are too.
Very, very good. And a lot of people very excited about this. This is a very special year for Freemasonry. But before we begin, let me ask you a question. Why did you become a Freemason in the first place?
That's always a difficult question. Both my grandfathers were Freemasons, although not particularly active. And I was interested. I was curious, like so many other people. I was curious, and I said, I'd very much like to become a member. And I did. I think I was 21 or 22 at the time. And I had no idea what was going on. I found it extremely difficult to understand what I was meant to be memorizing. And after about 3 or 4 years, work took me away and I stopped going for probably 15 years.
And that's quite common, isn't it, for people to return back to Freemasonry, isn't it, after work or family takeover?
Yeah, you know, it was only when a friend of mine said in a very sort of roundabout way, asking whether I was on the square, you know, and I said to him, are you asking if I'm a Freemason? I said, yes. He invited me to become a member of his lodge. And things then started to move forward. It was a lovely little lodge. I think I was old enough to understand what was going on. My ability to memorize ritual had improved over the years. And it was then, and I think only then, that I actually started to enjoy it.
And that's as I say, that's quite a common story, isn't it? So let's talk about our topic tonight. And is it fair to say that a lot of Freemasons, not all, but a lot of Freemasons have limited idea of what Freemasonry achieved when we talk about our philosophical, scientific and social change? Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Well, I've not done a survey, so, you know, I can only talk anecdotally. But on the basis of the people that I know and that I've met over the years, and indeed on the basis of presentations I've done both inside and on behalf of Grand Lodge, yes, I think that's a very fair assessment. Most Freemasons, and not only in this country, but most Freemasons really have no understanding of the actual origins of the craft and what it has achieved over the years. Yeah. So and it's extremely sad. It's extremely sad.
It is, but this should hopefully go a long way to what we're doing this year to fix that a little bit. So let's talk about the idea of celebrating 1723 Constitutions and making this a very big year. Why did you decide to do that and get involved in that first?
Well, I guess it was almost 4 years ago now that you know, we'd celebrated the Tercentenary of the formation of the first Grand Lodge, 2017. And to a very large extent, and you know, I'll be criticized for saying this, but so what? You know, I mean, 1717, so what? That wasn't, as I would see it, the beginning of what we have today as Freemasonry. That came along a couple of years later, and it was crystallized with the 1723 Constitutions. Two things happened in the period between 1717 and 1723. The first was the introduction of a very prominent figure, the Duke of Montague, someone who was, and I'll use this comparison loosely, who is a sort of George Clooney of his day. Okay? I mean, someone who could command attention in the press massively, whose everyday doings were, right out there, who people looked at pretty positively, regardless, who was extremely wealthy. But unlike George Clooney, Montagu was also incredibly connected to the crown and the leading politicians of the day. So here was a figure who was, at the top of society. He was plugged in all respects, and not just socially. I mean, he was interested in science. He was interested in social causes, all of those things. And in 1721, he agreed to become the first noble Grand Master of Grand Lodge, and that put Freemasonry on the map. But what cemented its position was the publication and then the dissemination of the constitutions, which put the organization onto a completely different footing. And I think that if we're going to celebrate anything, if we're going to mark and commemorate, we should be doing that. Something which is fundamentally important, not just the opening of a door, here's an organization, blah, 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 but here's something really substantive.
That's a really good point. And we'll get back to the Duke of Montagu a little bit later on. But let's go back to what Freemasonry looked like prior to 1723. What was it like back then?
Well, to be clear, we don't really know, because the evidence that we have really stems from around 1721, which is when Montagu came on board. Before then, the written records are almost non-existent. There are very few, if any, books of minutes. We have a little bit that goes on in the press, but in essence, before 1721, certainly before 1717, Freemasonry was a pretty inconsequential organization. It didn't exist as a national structure. There were lodges in individual towns up and down the length and breadth of Britain. We know what was going on in Scotland because it was documented there. In England, the documentation is a lot more sparse, but we know there were lodges in Chester, in Warrington, in York, etc. But we don't have a huge amount of information about what was going on. We can speculate. And we know that over the course of the prior 300-400 years, Freemasonry had changed from an organization that was principally operative to an organization that became principally social. And that the change was brought about essentially because the operative lodges were looking for patronage. So patronage from the local aristocracy, from the gentry. They wanted to create bonds between themselves and those people who would commission the building works in the local, towns and cities and so on. And that process was not just something that was experienced by stonemasons. It was something that happened in pretty much every guild, and not just in England. It happened across Northern Europe. So what was different was the way in which the stonemasons' lodges became modern Freemasonry, and that was the crux. That didn't happen to any other guild or any other similar organization. That was specific to stonemasons and to Freemasonry.
So that's a bit of an insight into what Freemasonry was like as far as we know. But what was life like for everybody else leading up to 1723?
This is a wonderful subject. Yeah.
What was it like back then, Rick?
Well, for most people, it was pretty crummy, to be honest. You're looking at a society, and I just look at London to start with. London, you had the what were called the deserving poor. So 90% of the population in London was poor. I mean, some were very poor, some were very, very, very poor. Some had jobs that basically provided them with a subsistence or subsistence wage. Others didn't. You had a whole community of hawkers and beggars and so on. Mortality rates were vast. I mean, people sort of think that London, huge city, expanded over time. It didn't expand through natural birth. The mortality rates were such that without immigration, London would have shrunk in population size. But London acted as this enormous vacuum, sucking in people from the provinces and from overseas. So if you look at London in the second decade and the third decade of the 18th century, you're looking at a population of 550,000, fairly stable actually for the first 30 or 40 years. Of the 10% who weren't impoverished, around 1% could be called gentry, aristocracy, and so on. And the remaining 8 to 9% would be what we would see now as a sort of burgeoning middle class, merchants, traders, apothecaries, doctors, that sort of individual. But what we are seeing throughout this period is massive development, first in agriculture, where productivity really takes off at the end of the 17th century. And then as the 18th century moves on, nascent industrialization. And this again begins to suck more and more people into what become larger and larger towns and cities. But you're looking at a country that is a fraction of the size of France. And I want to emphasize this because the relationship between England and France is pivotal at this point. France has a population of some 18 million, huge population, has a standing army of 1 million. England has a population of just about 5 million.
Wow.
Okay, so a fraction of the size. And to put it again into perspective, Ireland has a population of the same size. So Ireland has a population of about 5 million, England about 5 million, Scotland about 2 and a bit, France 18.
So it's good to hear that and to see what we were dealing with at the time and the amount of people that were around. But what was the driving force, the main reasons behind the constitutions being created in the first place? What was the driving force behind that, Ric, that made this happen?
I think really 3 things. You've got to look at the individuals involved. Things don't happen of their own accord. They happen because people make them happen. And you need to look at the individuals and try and understand what were the principal motivations. So let's take the key figure behind the development, the changes in English Freemasonry, a chap called Jean Theophilus Desaguliers. So here's a guy who was brought to England as a child, as a baby, probably one and a half, no more than 2 years old. He was a French Protestant, his father, mother, French Protestants fleeing persecution in France. Now, this has been 150 years of what would realistically be called genocide today. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of French Protestants were slaughtered over the preceding century. And religious wars had played out across Europe for some considerable time. So these people were fleeing France, not just for the ability to practice their own faith, but to avoid persecution on a massive scale. And that created some serious drivers. When you're looking at migrant population, when you're looking at an emigre population, and this was a big population, 50-odd thousand or more in London, 10% of the population, hugely influential, hugely important. What are they looking for? They're looking to survive, fundamentally. They're looking to protect their families, and they do this in a number of ways. One of the ways is through education. And you see French Protestants, Huguenots at the leading edge of education. They become highly patriotic because they see in the Hanoverians in particular, in George I and in George II, almost a personal manifestation of someone who will protect them. But they also saw that, of course, in William and Mary, who'd replaced James II, who'd been deposed. They saw it in Queen Anne, again, although a Stuart monarch, a Protestant Stuart monarch. So these were people who were fundamentally motivated to support what was then the Whig, the Protestant status quo, but not to do it in a sort of blinkered way. They were looking very much towards the future, and the future was one of religious tolerance. And the future was based on Newtonian Enlightenment principles. So moving away from education by church diktat, which was the pattern across Europe, the Catholic Church determined what was truth, towards a much more open, fact-based, observational, rational base. And that, writ large, was what were the driving forces behind Freemasonry. Not just Desaguliers, but you look at the Duke of Montagu, you look at the Duke of Richmond, you look at other key figures who were involved in Freemasonry at that time, and they shared this consensus view, this Enlightenment view, this progressive view. And Freemasonry was cast in that mold. Now, it is interesting to speculate whether Freemasonry was cast in that mold because they wanted it to become a vehicle for the promulgation of these ideas, or whether it was cast in that mold simply because these were people who had that mindset, who had those ideas. I think, in fact, it was probably a combination of the two, and as time went by, it became a more and more powerful vector for the promotion of Enlightenment ideas, again, not just in this country, but much more broadly and internationally.
Well, let's talk about the authors, because it's fair to say, isn't it, that they brought something individually to the party. What did they each bring in? And obviously we need to celebrate them as well.
Okay, well, I think in Desaguliers, you have a highly intelligent figure with these very powerful drivers. I mean, don't forget that Desaguliers, despite being an emigre, despite being brought up in poverty, was a Servitor scholar at Oxford, became Newton's assistant, was a fellow of the Royal Society, was appointed curator there, received enormous success as a lecturer, again, not just nationally, but internationally, was a pioneer for science and so on. So his contribution, I think, is fairly obvious. In George Payne, his co-author, someone who was very plugged into the system. He was a leading magistrate. He was deputy master of the Horn Tavern, the most important lodge in London, whose master was the Duke of Richmond. So he gave Desaguliers and the nascent Freemasons connections in the right social spaces, in the magistracy, contrary to the aristocracy, into what we would now call the civil service, the upper echelons of the civil service, parliament, and so on. And then in James Anderson, you have what I call, and what others have called, a hired pen, someone who will do a lot of the grunt work, and in particular would write the traditional history of Freemasonry. And let me comment on that, because I've had so many questions over the years from people who take the traditional history as a literal record of event, or who criticize it because it wasn't a truthful, literal record of events. It was never designed to be that. This was a literary technique that was used in the 18th century and had been used for centuries before to position Freemasonry or any organization of a similar type as a long-standing, tradition-based organization, because it gave it substance and credibility. So, when people start to talk about Freemasonry's origins in Egypt and in ancient Rome and ancient wherever, these were constructs that were designed to place Freemasonry in a historical context. They weren't designed to be taken seriously.
No, I think it's important that you mentioned that. And how long did it take them to do? Because we've seen the video, and if you haven't seen our usually video, by the way, highlighting how the 1723 Constitution took place, make sure you track that down. But how long did it actually take them, in essence, to create?
We don't know for certain, but if you look at the timeline, it's likely that it was around 2 years.
Right, wow, that's quick, isn't it?
I don't know whether it was that quick. I mean, if you take as an example how long it took to resuscitate the Order of the Bath, which happened only a couple of years later, that really only took 6 months or less to construct or to reconstruct. If you look at the book as a whole, it's got 4 or 5 different sections. You've got the traditional history, which, you know, I can see Anderson sitting down of an evening and writing it, and so on. You know, partly making it up, obviously. The charges, we're only looking at 2 or 3 pages there. The regulations, again, it's only a short number of pages, you know, 2, 3, 4 pages. And then we have a section which is songs. So, you know, people have composed music in one instance, or they've taken existing tunes and they've superimposed new words. So, I mean, you're looking at a book that's 68 pages long. It's not that long. I mean, if it's 66 or 68 or 69, you know, that's the order of magnitude. And it's got an introduction, and it's got various other things too. So it's not a massive book. It's the sort of thing you could probably knock out a lot more quickly. But yeah, I would guess 2 years, simply because it was instigated by Montague and it was published in 1723, and that's a period of 2 years.
Oh, thank you, Rick. Really appreciate that. And we'll get back to talking about Montague in just a moment. But to our first question, and brethren, thank you ever so much indeed for sending them in time-honored fashion. I won't be able to get through all of them, and I'll have to find the appropriate moment to slot them in. But Liam Kenny's been in touch, and he says, "Good evening, Dr. Berman and Brodie." Good evening, Liam. With 1723 Book of Constitutions, what were the main issues facing lodges at the time that you could pick up from the rules contained inside? So what were the main issues going on within the lodges back then?
Okay, I think you've got to understand that a lodge then was a completely different vehicle,
yes,
to a lodge now. So let's look at the few lodges that we know about, because we don't have detailed information on many. We have detailed information on just a few. So first of all, there was virtually no ritual when Freemasonry started back in 1717, 1718 in its current form, okay? There was virtually no ritual. That was introduced by Desaguliers and others in a sort of evolving sense from 1718, 1920 onwards through to the 1730s. It only crystallized really in 1813, when the original Grand Lodge of England merged with the Ancients Grand Lodge, formed the Lodge of Reconciliation, and then constructed what we now have as Masonic ritual. There was Masonic ritual in advance of that, obviously, but Masonic ritual would vary lodge by lodge, region by region, town by town, etc. So the principal purpose of the meetings, so far as we understand, were really 3 or 4-fold. There would be catechisms in the same way that these were used by stonemasons' lodges, the ancient charges, and these were used in an allegorical sense. So there would be testing of those. There would be dining and drinking, fraternalism, if you will, and there would be lectures. There would be self-improving lectures. And these could be outsiders coming into the lodge, or they could be members of the lodge talking about their hobbies, or there would be professionals within the lodge. So it was a very, very different construct. Now, it varied, as I say, town by town, country by country. In some parts of England, you would have lodges that were principally social, and they would only evolve into, you know, what we have as a current lodge over a considerable period of time. Elsewhere, they would be more focused on the ritual as it evolved. So it's very difficult to say what were they like, how did this change. What Grand Lodge did from 1723 onwards was to set down, if you will, parameters, ground rules, and begin to impose a structure onto what were at the time a series, we don't know how many, but let's assume in the first instance, tens or 20s of individual, quite distinct lodges. Over time, as they evolved, they became grounded, set down on the same foundations. But that was an evolving process. And what we see in the 1723 constitutions is the start of that, with the charges. These are the philosophical principles to which we adhere as Freemasons, and the regulations. This is how we run ourselves as an organization. And if you want to be part of us, if you want to be within the umbrella of the Grand Lodge of England, you must abide by these criteria.
Thank you, Rick. And Liam, thank you for your question. I really agree. You have just received a gold class answer. So thank you, Rick. It's what we would expect, isn't it? And we'll get back to some more of your questions in a moment. But let's go back to the George Clooney of his day. That is the best analogy I think I've ever heard on a Solomon Live. John, Duke of Montague. I think it's fair to say that he moved Freemasonry forward and helped to establish the Book of Constitutions. But how did he do that?
I'm not sure that Montague actually did anything. He was a figurehead. I mean, let's be clear. He was a figurehead. Most, not all, but most aristocrats at that time were figureheads. They lent their imprimatur. They lent their prestige, and that was very important, and was recognised as such. But let's look at Montague as an individual. Why was he chosen, and why was he a great choice? His father, who was also very plugged in to the court, was Britain's or England's ambassador to France. And he lived in Paris during the period when the Huguenots were being severely slaughtered. And he took that memory back with him. When he came back to England, back to Boughton Hall, back to London, he had an entourage of Huguenots, educated, intelligent men. They were the people who surrounded the young John. They were his tutors. He grew up surrounded by Huguenot influence. Indeed, his relations included Huguenots. I think his cousins were also Huguenots. So a very wealthy man, very well connected, but who also understood intimately the Huguenot issue in France, was very sympathetic to the cause. He was married to the Duke of Marlborough's youngest daughter. The Duke of Marlborough, of course, Blenheim Palace, was an icon. I mean, here is a man who'd gone out and defeated the French, and that takes me back to 18 million people versus England, 5 million, standing army of 1 million, we have a little army. And he'd been massively successful. When Marlborough died, John Duke of Montague was the chief mourner at the funeral, I mean, closely associated with a figure who was, as I say, an icon in what we can describe as the Whig pantheon of figures. So politically well connected, very well connected at the court. He was, among other things, the hereditary master of the royal wardrobe, which paid a fortune. He was Lord Lieutenant of not just one, but 2 counties. He had his own regiment of horse, which he financed, of foot, which he financed. He was colonel-in-chief of the Life Guards, I think it was. Militarily, socially, politically, he was right at the top. So yeah, the George Clooney of his day. He earned the equivalent of about 40 million a year. What? Just from his rental properties.
That's incredible, isn't it? That's incredible. Now, Rick, we've got a lot to get through in the next 15 and 20 minutes.
Okay.
So let's continue our journey and let's talk about the Book of Constitutions after they were released and were launched, if you will. How were they received? Because this was kind of pioneering stuff, wasn't it?
this was hugely pioneering stuff, and I think the best gauge to their success is the degree to which they were pirated by other publishers, not just in England, but across Europe and in America. Don't forget that copyright didn't exist in those days, so it was a pretty big free-for-all. And they were translated, so within a few years of their publication, they were translated into Dutch, into French, into German, and they were being read across Europe. You take Benjamin Franklin in America, and I mean, Franklin was a very entrepreneurial guy, and he didn't publish anything if he didn't think he'd make money from it. And in 1734, he produced a verbatim copy of the 23 constitutions for sale in America, and they were sold. And obviously before that time, they were being exported and pirated and so on out of London and out of Dublin. But yes, it was, you have to bear in mind that not everyone was literate. I mean, education was not great. So this was restricted to those who could read, but it was a growing number. And yes, they were massively impactful. And if you go on to the 1723 constitutions.com website, you'll see a huge list, which is not exhaustive, but a huge list of all the different versions of the constitutions that were produced after and from the first in 1723.
Brilliant. Now, how did the book, when we look at what we have today, how did the book change Freemasonry as we know it? Because it provided a rule book, it provided a structure. How did it change things for us, the Freemasonry that we know today?
I think, as I said, really it set down parameters for the first time. It codified to a significant extent what we were doing and why we were doing it. And I'm emphasizing here why we were doing it. In Britain, we see Freemasonry today as something which can be summarized in a couple of rather cliched phrases. Why do you want to be a Freemason? Well, it makes good men better. Whatever that means. We're there because we produce charity and so on. But actually, what Freemasonry was about, and what it is still about, really, is relieving distress. And distress is not just charity. And when we talk about fraternalism, we're not just talking about brotherhood, we're talking about a respect for humanity and an empathy with humanity. And when we talk about education, how Freemasons are improved by education, but education, it is education alone that renders us fit members of society. What do we mean by education? Education is not going to school. Education is self-awareness, self-knowledge, knowledge of society, personal improvement and societal improvement. And that is what was behind the ideas that were promulgated in 1723. And that's, in my view, what we need to get back to in terms of understanding our roots. And by understanding our roots, we can understand our present and our future. He who controls history controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about how the 1723 constitutions enabled Freemasonry to spread over the world. How did it do that, Ric?
Well, Freemasonry itself was driven by a whole series of different vectors. You've got migration, obviously. You've got military expansion. You've got trade. You've even got visits by aristocrats who were Freemasons, who would take their Freemasonry with them when they went overseas. So it was transported by a whole series of different mechanisms, but that in itself wouldn't have been sufficient to really gain traction. So bear in mind, the 18th century was a period of change, was a period of real change. And Britain was the leading light, the first industrial power, preeminent maritime power, and by the 1760s, probably the preeminent military power in the Western world, having defeated France in the 1760s. So what did Freemasonry offer? Freemasonry was closely associated with Enlightenment thought, scientific progress. When Desaguliers went to France, went to the Netherlands to lecture, who would attend? Members of the aristocracy, the merchant classes, royalty. Why? Not just because Desaguliers was a good lecturer, but because what he represented, what Freemasonry represented, was a leading edge of culture. And that was a key driver. You know, why was it, even in the 19th century, why was it that so many in India wanted to become Freemasons? Half of the presidents of the Indian National Congress, half of them were Freemasons, which is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. I can talk about that separately. But
well, only due to time reasons, let's try and squeeze in as many questions as we can, Rick. And so other than England, what country would you say benefited the most from the 1723 Constitution?
I think America has got to be seen as a prime candidate for that. Freemasonry in America really was a school for government. It brought a whole new approach. It captured what was the new American zeitgeist. It is no coincidence that the same Enlightenment principles that are found in Freemasonry are found in the Declaration of Independence. And so many of those who were involved in the formation of America as the United States and the individual state, it is no coincidence that so many of them were Freemasons. But I could make similar arguments for Latin America in the 19th century and Spain, even Spain, where Freemasons were absolutely at the forefront of political change, again at the turn of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th. Ireland, hugely important. Freemasonry became pretty much the single location where Catholics and Protestants could meet on the level. India, you know, one could go on and on, but I think I will say that America was the prime candidate because so much of what is embodied in America's Constitution and in the way American democracy works, I'm not saying it's based on, okay, I'm not saying it's based on, but is closely related to what Freemasonry proposed. And because so many Freemasons were involved in that process, it is inconceivable that there wasn't an overlap between the two.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And back to the questions, going back a stage, I guess, but a lot of people would like to know, including Harvey, Grand Lodge was formed in 1717, we know that. Why did it take so long for the constitutions to come out following that pivotal moment in Freemason history?
That's a very good question. I think there are a number of factors behind it, but the most obvious one is that it's expensive to really produce a book. You know, this is not a cheap exercise. In order to produce a book, you need to have a following. In order to have a following, you need to have a leader, a figurehead. Montague was that person. So from the time that Montague came on board, it didn't take that long. It took a couple of years. But there are other factors involved. And I'll go back to the influence, or one of the influences behind Freemasonry in the early 18th century. And that was fear of the Jacobites, fear that James Stuart would return to England with the support of France or Spain and take the English throne. So what has happened? Well, in 1715, there was the first Jacobite rising. That was only put down in 1716. But in 1717, there was another attempted invasion. And in 1719, another attempted invasion. And in 1721, another attempted insurrection. So these drivers, you're looking at a Huguenot population and a Whig population that's genuinely fearing, in one instance, for their lives, and in the other instance for their political and their financial life. So these were huge drivers, huge motivations behind putting together an organizational structure that would have some endurance. And I think that would have really encouraged these guys to get a move on. But first things first form the basic structure, 1717, then get a really effective figurehead in the shape of Montague and others that followed. And then let's move to the constitutions, formulate them, agree them, publish them.
And it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that it went from there to there to there, doesn't it, when you explain it like that? Tony, he's given us a really good question this evening. What would Freemasons of today think, what would Freemasons of the day think of Freemasonry today, do you think?
I think there'd be certain aspects that they would recognize, but I suspect that they would be horrified by others. You know, when you look at the Book of Constitutions today, the core of the constitutions is really just the old charges, the ancient charges. And the ancient charges, and I find this quite sad actually, the ancient charges are recited by the incoming master. You know, he will give his consent to those, etc. But to be honest, those charges should be accepted by every entered apprentice when he enters the lodge. And that I suspect would have been the case at the time. So from an organization that was very much founded on a combination of intellectual enlightenment, religious tolerance, you know, leading edge of society, an organization that was proud to put itself out there, you know, in a significant way, you know, public processions, the press reporting, initiations, attendance at meetings. I mean, every newspaper would record Masonic meetings and the charity that was being given and all of that stuff. That, I think, you know, from a position where Freemasonry commanded the heights of society, not just in England, but in Ireland, in America, and in many other countries across Europe. From that, I think we have gone sideways, if not backwards, and I think they would find that quite surprising.
Brilliant answer and a superb question. So we've only got a few minutes left, Rick. So are you ready for a quick fire round of questions? Because we always knew when you and I have had our conversations off air, if you will, that we would only scratch the surface this evening. And we've spoken about getting you back on as well. So quick fire round. Are copies of Anderson's Constitutions available to buy, originals or reprints?
Yes, you can buy them. Just search online. There are copies. There are facsimile copies, all available online. If you don't want to buy them, you can download or just read them on the 1723constitutions.com website.
Brilliant. And the special meeting at Grand Lodge took place, didn't it, on the 31st of January? Had so much great feedback about that. And of course, we created the video for the special meeting as well. I was referring to a little bit earlier on. Definitely recommended. What was that meeting like for you? Because we spoke earlier on, didn't we, about the reason why we needed to celebrate this and how important it was. I guess that was the culmination of it. What was that like for you?
I think it was, I mean, on the one hand, it was an enormous pleasure. On the other hand, I was really constrained by time. So I was absolutely under the cosh not to go over more than really a quarter of an hour on my intro before we hit the film and then introduced Akram for his talk. So as a result of that, I did something I very, very rarely do, which was to read from a script. So I didn't go over, and it was a script that I'd had to rewrite twice that morning because so much of what I was going to say had been covered or was about to be covered in the film. And I didn't want to repeat something excessively. So the film was then followed by Akram doing a masterclass in a presentation to a large audience. So I feel if I could do the same thing again, I would throw away my notes, talk off the cuff, which is what I prefer to do by far, and given Akram a run for his money.
Oh, well, hindsight's a great thing, isn't it? But no, you did a sensational job, and that's according to the feedback. And you know what Freemasons are like? That's the crack. And What else is going on this year in order for us to celebrate this tercentenary? So we've had the special meeting. You're joining us here. I know you're a very busy man, travelling around the world in the UK, talking more about this, including coming to visit us in Worcestershire as well, which is wonderful. What else can people enjoy to encourage them to celebrate this year?
Well, we have a number of things lined up. We've got a year-long exhibition at the Museum of Freemasonry in London, which is really worth a visit. And for those who meet at FMH or who visit FMH, just take 20 minutes out of your time before a lodge meeting. Just go up to the first floor, and visit the museum. Wander around the exhibition. It's free. You know, it's informative. You can look at stuff at a superficial level, in depth. We've got QR codes on every cabinet, on every panel. You can get into more stuff in depth. Do that. We have a conference in Cambridge in September, which is going to be incredible. We've got academics from around the world, Freemasons, non-Masons. We're going to get together. We're going to talk about this, have some serious conversations. And yes, we've got a series of talks provincially, regionally, to get the message out there, to give people the opportunity to listen to this stuff and to ask questions. Most importantly, to ask questions. It doesn't matter how stupid you think the questions are, ask them. You know, if you've got something that bugs you, mention it. And if I or if others can answer, we will. And if we can't, then we'll say so.
Well, final word, Rick, and on behalf of everybody who's watching this evening and Freemasons as a whole, thank you so much for the work you've done in helping us celebrate what was an incredible year for Freemasonry. So obviously this is something lovely. We can have a lot of fun. What are you hoping the legacy of this year will be?
Well, I hadn't really thought about it, but I think off the cuff, I think it will, I hope it will encourage Freemasons to think more deeply about why they are Masons. And when people ask them, why are you a Mason? To be able to say with some pride and with some knowledge, this is why I'm a Mason, and then explain.
Absolutely. Dr. Ric Berman, have you enjoyed your Solomon Live experience?
I didn't think I would, but I have. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's fantastic. And we've thoroughly enjoyed having you as well. And ladies and gentlemen and brethren, we have some fantastic Solomon Lives coming up in the next few months. So please make sure you keep an eye on your emails and our social media pages for more information on that. And if you haven't done so already, why not? Make sure you register for Solomon. You'll find it at solomon.ujeli.org.uk, full of useful and fantastic papers to enhance your daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. Thank you for joining us this evening. Have a very good evening, and we'll see you back here very, very soon. Good night, everybody.